Welcome to Chapter 18 for AP Economics, Structured Independent Study. Chapter 18 is about fiscal policy and management. In other words, how the government goes about trying to manage its finances and the economy. We're going to start this chapter by first looking at fiscal policy before we look at fiscal management. And in looking at fiscal policy, we're going to define what it is and also take a look at some of the philosophies behind it. We're going to take a look at how it affects the economy, the fiscal policy that's adopted by the government, and what the limits are of fiscal policy. And as I mentioned a moment ago, a little bit on the philosophies by comparing and contrasting three of the most commonly known philosophical policy approaches, which are the classical, Keynesian, and supply-side type policies. And then we'll wrap up the policy section of this chapter by taking a quick look at the role that fiscal policy has played in American economic history. And then we'll move on to the management, the fiscal management side of things. In other words, how the federal government goes about managing its finances. We're going to look at the federal budget and how it's created. We're going to look at the concept of budget balance and deficits. Once again, we'll take a look at the national debt and consider the problems that it may cause us. And then we'll wrap up the section on fiscal management by considering how deficits and the national debt could possibly be reduced. And then this chapter gets wrapped up by covering two very important concepts: the multiplier effect and the velocity of money. So let's start this chapter in this section on fiscal policy, as we traditionally do, by introducing you to a couple of fundamental concepts and also defining a couple of fundamental terms to get us started. And why not start right at the beginning with the word fiscal? And where does it come from? Well, it's got its roots in Latin with the word fisc. And what fisc meant in Latin was basket or bag, but over time it became known as bag of money. Now, it's no surprise that fiscal policy, in what we've been referring to, has something to do with money. So then what is fiscal policy? It's the way the federal government uses taxing and spending in its effort to keep the economy stable. Said another way, fiscal policy is the government's tool for impacting aggregate supply and aggregate demand. And yes, there is great power in controlling over $2 trillion in spending. So exactly how does this work? Well, let's take a look. So how does fiscal policy work at trying to control the economy? Well, the key in the power of fiscal policy to have an impact on aggregate supply and aggregate demand is in the power of the multiplier effect. Now, let me stop there for a second. I had mentioned a few moments ago that we'd be looking at the multiplier effect later in the chapter, and that is true, we will. As a matter of fact, we're going to look at some illustrations at how the multiplier effect works. But here we want to lay out the initial concept because it's really at the heart of fiscal policy having that impact on aggregate supply and demand. And what the multiplier effect is the idea that every $1 change in spending by the government or not spending by the government creates a greater than $1 change in the national income. Think of it very much like, it's extremely similar to like how banks make money when they loan money out. Now, a moment ago I had mentioned the government either spending or not spending when I was talking about the multiplier effect. And the spending or not spending leads us to the two strategies for fiscal policy. If the government wants to try to encourage the economy to expand and to grow, it will spend. And it can do that in a couple of ways. And when it does that, we call that an expansionary fiscal policy. What the government's trying to do is to increase output by either cutting taxes or literally increasing the spending that the government does. Now, expansionary policy to increase output and encourage growth, if we cut taxes, it looks like this. With the tax rate going down, it leads to people having more disposable income, an increase in disposable income, and that also will lead to an increase in consumption and investment. And when those two things happen, we see an increase in aggregate demand. Well, how does it work with government spending? A little bit different. When the government literally spends dollars on projects, it many times creates jobs, and when jobs are created, consumption and income, disposable income as well as consumption and investment go up because people now are employed and they're getting paid, and that leads to an increase in aggregate demand. Let's now take a look at the other side of the coin. In the situation where the government wants to try to slow the economy down, what they'll do is they'll implement a contractionary fiscal policy. Contractionary meaning to constrict growth. They try to decrease the output and therefore the growth by doing the opposite of what they do with expansionary. In this case, they increase taxes and or they can do both, decrease spending. And our equations look the opposite from what they did under an expansionary policy. Here you have an increase in taxes, takes money out of the pockets of businesses and individual consumers, so disposable income is decreased. That will lead to a decrease in consumption and investment, and as a result will lead to a decrease in aggregate demand. If the government stops spending money on projects, it's very likely that some jobs will be eliminated. And again, when people have jobs eliminated, they don't have a paycheck in their hand, their disposable income is reduced. And when disposable income is reduced, consumption and investment also gets reduced. And then we have the reduction in overall aggregate demand. Fiscal policy is both difficult to implement and to manage. And there are 5 reasons for this, and we can call these the 5 limitations that are imposed upon fiscal policy. Here's the first. There's great difficulty in changing spending levels and changing what to spend money on, as so much of the government spending is tied up or dictated in entitlement mandatory spending programs, and that the government just doesn't have a choice. It's a matter of law that the money will be spent in a certain way and at certain levels. The second limitation is that our economy these days moves at lightning speed because of the support of technology. The trading goes on at lightning speed. So predicting the future and trying to set a fiscal policy in place is getting more and more difficult as the years go by. The third limitation is that, and this is closely coupled with the second, that if you're not on top of things and putting things in place in anticipation of what's going to happen, delayed results may wind up making a situation worse by throwing the economy further out of balance. So timing is very, very critical. And probably the biggest limitation, quite arguably, is this fourth one, in that political pressures play a role, particularly people's personal political agendas. You've been introduced to the concept of earmarks and I'm sure you're familiar with pork barrel legislation. It gets very difficult for congressmen and senators to do the right things in many cases in cuts to programs that may be pet projects for their particular state or district that funnel tremendous amounts of federal funds back into their home areas. And when the pressure is on, it really forces them politically to create unnatural acts and do things that may not be in the best interest for the long-term fiscal policy. The fifth limitation is the coordination of policy. And this is very important too, and it's coordination from two standpoints. First, state and local governments may be pursuing different goals and a different policy on their own that may not mesh up or match up well to what the federal government's fiscal policy would be. And we've actually had occasions where they're in conflict. So that sends out some real messages of uncertainty, which rattles in many cases business community and can make fiscal policy far more difficult to manage if it's not coordinated well at the state with the states and the local governments. And very importantly, fiscal policy and actions must be coordinated with the monetary policies put in place by the Federal Reserve Bank. Similar exposure here, that if the Federal Reserve Bank is going in one direction and taking some actions, let's say to contract the economy and to slow it down a little bit, while the federal government is taking actions to promote growth and expand it, we're going to have two different policies, monetary policy and fiscal policy, in conflict here, and that will have an effect on diluting the effectiveness of both. So that needs to be coordinated in the proper way as well. Let's next take a high-level conceptual look at the philosophies behind three of the most popular fiscal policies today. Here's the first. It's a fiscal policy based upon classical economics. In other words, the idea that free markets regulate themselves and that government should keep its role in the economy in trying to have an impact on growth or restriction, keep it very small. A second philosophy is the philosophy based upon Keynesian economics. Now, this view promotes a broader view of the economy, and that the economy is composed of three sectors: individuals, businesses, and government, and that it's government's role to take action when it's needed to make up for a lack of action in the other two, even if that results in deficit spending. The third fiscal policy is based upon the concept of supply-side economics. And supply-side economics believes that government control of the economy through taxes has a very strong influence on investment and economic output. Now, we know that is true. Certainly, if we increase taxes, it's going to result in a reduction of investment and economic output. Same with vice versa being true if we reduce taxes. However, the supply side also says that Keynesian philosophy uses government to change aggregate demand on the spending side to affect demand, while supply side policy tries to increase the other side, economic growth, by increasing private investment, which in turn will increase aggregate supply. Now, the idea behind supply-side fiscal policy is the brainchild of this man whose picture is in the upper right-hand corner of the screen. His name is Arthur Laffer. He was the chief economist for President Ronald Reagan. And the way he said we would go about increasing private investment and therefore aggregate supply is by optimizing the tax rate. And he developed what's called the Laffer curve, which there is a depiction of in the lower right-hand corner of the screen, and I will be discussing at greater length in the course resource center. But the idea here is that an optimal tax rate will keep the investors and the producers interested in continuing to supply a strong supply to the market. And really what Laffer was doing was proposing an enhanced version of an old law that's called Say's law, which states that supply creates demand. One note of caution here as we leave our look at the fundamental concepts behind the fiscal policy philosophies is that if you ever run into the Rand curve, don't confuse that with the Laffer curve. They're two different things. In general, the Rand curve theory is correct, but it must be used with some caution, and it is really quite a bit different than the Laffer curve. But what the Rand curve is, just to remove some of the mystery behind it and provide you with a little bit of an overview, it's the theory that the economy shrinks when government grows too large. And the thought process here is that, what needs to happen in an economy to grow is that we need to have incentive, we need to have competition, driving innovation and creative destruction and so forth. If the government becomes the dominant force in an economy in terms of employment and the functions performed and the revenue collected and so forth, the competitiveness is taken out of an economy, the innovation, the creative destruction, and what happens is an economy actually would begin to shrink. So that's some of the general overview theory behind the Rand curve, and again, it's different than the Laffer curve. And I'll be talking more about the comparison of the two in our discussions in the course resource center. So now, having looked at the different types of fiscal policy and the philosophies behind it, we're naturally led to the question, well, what should policy be? And I'm going to offer up 4 historical points to help you start thinking about that. Here's the first. For its first century, the United States was dominated by classical economic theory and fiscal policy. The result of that was the period of second greatest advancement in standard of living, because it was not only the United States, but also a lot of the nations in Western Europe, and particularly Great Britain, led to the second greatest advancement period in the standard of living in human history. So there's a marker out there to compare things against. Now, however, the Great Depression period in the early 1900s highlighted a problem with classical economic theory and policy. It did not address how long it would take, when left alone, for the overall market to return to equilibrium. And it was that time when John Maynard Keynes arrived on the scene. And Keynesian economics attempted to answer the difficult question of why does the actual production in an economy, like during a depression, sometimes fall far short of its productive capacity. Keynes believed that the Great Depression continued because neither consumers nor businesses had an incentive to spend enough to cause an increase in production. And Keynes argued that fiscal policy should be used to fight the two fundamental macroeconomic problems that we began to experience: periods of recession or depression, and also periods of inflation. And in addition, early on in Keynes's writings and in his speeches, he advocated a belief that if set up properly, fiscal policy could come close to automatically stabilizing the economy. Now, in later years, Keynes drifted towards a belief of deeper and more extensive involvement of the government in managing the economy. So he got away from this original idea. But the question is, could this have been true? And the answer is, we don't know, because over time, it has been used as a tool to leverage and promote socialist agendas. From World War II up into the 1980s, the most popular economic theories and practices across the globe were those of John Maynard Keynes. Many nations around the world took his theories and his practices and implemented them, including the United States. And during this period, there was one lone voice in the wilderness, if you will, that was advocating a return to classical economics and free market capitalism. And that was the voice of Friedrich Hayek up into the 1970s and 80s, when his charge was taken over by Milton Friedman, who continued the fight for a focus towards classical economics. But Hayek is considered the apostle of modern capitalism, and actually in many ways considered the philosophical father of the global economy that erupted after 1980 and ushered in the greatest advance in the standard of living of any period of time in human history, from the 1980s to the present day. And when Hayek was a lone voice in the wilderness, he said that based upon the fundamental nature of human drive for money and power, any government involvement in economic affairs other than to create appropriate public works would wind up leading to socialism. And he was correct. To get a better understanding of the differences in philosophy between Hayek and Keynes, I highly recommend the very entertaining parody that's contained in your short subject video list about the battle between the philosophies between these two men. It's well worth while. It's an entertaining format, and the differing philosophies are laid out in song. So don't skip that. Make sure you take that in. Let's move on now to the mechanical side of the federal government's fiscal responsibilities, that being fiscal management. And we'll start with the federal budget, and we'll define for you what the federal budget is. It's actually a written document indicating the amount of money the federal government expects to receive in taxes for the certain year, and it authorizes the amount the federal government can spend that year. And at this point, we should also define for you what a fiscal year is, because it's not the same as a traditional calendar year. A fiscal year is the 12-month period that a budget covers. The fiscal government uses a fiscal year that runs not from January to December, but from October 1st through September 30th. Now, there are 6 steps that the federal government goes through in the annual federal budget process. And just as an aside, states go through similar types of processes as these, with some variation. So let's take a look at the 6 steps. It starts early in a fiscal year, meaning that it's like the November to January time frame, that the executive branch departments and agencies prepare needs statements for the upcoming year. And they also, as part of this, lay out spending proposals. And the Office of Management and Budget, which is part of the executive branch, reviews the proposals usually in midwinter, like the January-February timeframe, creates the budget and sends it to Congress. During the late winter and early spring, while Congress debates the budget that's proposed by the executive branch, the Congressional Budget Office advises Congress on that budget that's been proposed. And the Congressional Budget Office is the counterpart to the executive branch's budget office, which is the Office of Management and Budget, the OMB, which I spoke about a moment ago. Now, Congress must adopt an initial resolution, meaning an initial budget, a draft, by May 15th of each year, and that's by law. And Congress then must adopt a final resolution by September 15th in preparation for the new year starting October 1st, and send it back to the president for signature, which then goes into law. The president must then either sign or veto the budget that was sent to him by Congress by September 30th, the end of the current fiscal year and the start of the new. So here's a question for you. What happens if the president exercises his or her veto and rejects the budget sent to he or she by Congress? Well, this has happened a couple of times in our recent past, and what happens is that the government actually shuts down non-essential services and government functions are put on the shelf and shut down until the Congress and the executive branch agree on a fiscal plan moving forward. Other essential services like the Defense Department and a few others remain operating through this budget crisis. For a couple of decades now, people have grown concerned over the federal government budgeting process and have actually asked the question, why do we even bother to go through it? The reason being is that the federal government has not shown too much fiscal discipline in adhering to a budget because it routinely far overspends the amount of money that it takes in taxes. And it has led some of these people to actually come up with a new definition of economics, and they're using this. Every country owes nothing, owing money in catastrophic sums. See the first letters there of spelling out economics. And quite frankly, the deficits which are leading into our rapidly growing and expanding and problematic national debt might make these people right. So just one more time, let's define what the federal budget deficit is. It's when expenditures exceed revenues. A balanced budget is a noble goal, but it's almost never achieved by the federal government. And it's not necessarily to say we always have to have a balanced budget, but what has happened in recent decades is that we have gone in one direction heavily, where we have built enormous deficits and contributed to an enormous national debt. So it leads to another question. Can we balance the federal budget in any way, shape, or form? And there are really 5 options to manage a budget deficit, and none of them are pretty. In fact, choosing one or a combination of the options is going to lead to some pain, but maybe that's what really needs to be done. So let's look at what the 5 options would be. The first thing you can do is you can cut expenses, stop spending. Now, this is hard to do, as we have seen in the past, and it could be politically suicidal when you think about those earmarks, the pork barrel legislation, and people's personal political agendas. A second option would be to increase spending, but that only is throwing gasoline on the fire and could be economically suicidal. The third option could be to increase taxes, but again, like cutting spending, that would be politically suicidal as well and a real tough call to make. The fourth option, create meaning print, make more money available. But that's going to unleash the inflation monster from the cage. And I'll tell you from having firsthand experience, periods of raging inflation are very, very painful for a society to endure. And the last option would be to borrow money. And that, over the long haul, is only, again, throwing gasoline on the fire. It digs the hole deeper, especially from the national debt perspective. And speaking of the national debt, I once again want to spend a minute on it, just to make sure you have a thorough understanding of what this involves. The national debt is the net accumulation of federal budget deficit spending, plus the interest that's paid on the money to be used to do that deficit spending. And importantly, the national debt does not include the liabilities of Social Security and Medicare. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. And let's quickly take a look at a number of issues regarding the national debt that you should be aware of. First, the debt is now in excess of $18 trillion and rapidly increasing. That translates into more than $55,000 per person in the United States. And the debt is accruing interest at about 12% per year. The interest payments on the debt, the loans alone, are in excess of 20% of the federal budget going to pay that interest. Approximately 60% of the country's total debt, this is the national debt plus other major types of debt, is in the hands of foreign entities. Not that some debt in the hands of foreign entities is a bad thing, because direct foreign investment, as we'll come to understand, is part of the global trade aspects of things, and is good to have that kind of cross-border investment. However, with regard to our national debt and the T-bill situation, the majority of the national debt is in the hands of foreign entities, particularly China, who's one of the biggest buyers of federal T-bills. So here's how the total debt, the country's total debt beyond the national debt, completely lays out. 45% of it is in T-bills, 25% in corporate loans owned by foreign entities, and 12% of stock. Debt, and particularly the national debt and the government's continued funding of deficits, causes a crowding out effect. It helps to reduce funds available for business investment. And we'll talk more about the crowding out effect in the next chapter on monetary policy. We'll actually show how we can graphically represent that. The next item I want to talk about regarding the national debt is that the balanced budget amendment, which would make a lot of sense, is continually voted down in Congress because of the vested interests and the political concerns in protecting, return revenue going back to states and particular districts for the politicians. And the last item regarding the national debt is probably the most concerning and troublesome. As I mentioned a few moments ago, the national debt in excess of $18 trillion does not include the payments that are required, mandatory entitlement payments for Social Security and Medicare. And starting in 2010, we made the turn with the baby boomer generation, where the Social Security fund and Medicare funds are being depleted rapidly. And I believe the latest projections by the Congressional Budget Office is sometime by the early 2030s, the Social Security Medicare funds will be completely empty, and we will not have enough working citizens contributing into those funds to cover the payouts going in the opposite direction to senior citizens and for Medicare coverage as well as their Social Security. So if we keep running up the tab, 18 trillion plus, and then we're facing this obligation, which is a mandatory obligation by law to pay out in Social Security and Medicare, that potential for the numbers for the debt will just beyond skyrocket further. And that's a big troublesome point that we as a society are going to need to face very soon. It's quite common to grade the presidents on how they handle fiscal affairs. So let's have some fun for a moment and take a look at the last couple of presidents and see how they've done with regard to their handling of those affairs. Because we're limited in space here on our slide, let's consider the last two presidents, Mr. Bush and Mr. Obama. And over here on the left, we have the measurements that are used in the fiscal report card, if you will, and we have each one of their terms, their first and second terms. So let's run down our list of measurements. And at the top of the list is always our economic growth, our GDP. So here's how things have worked out. Mr. Bush, in his first term in office, pulls a grade of about an A minus. Growth under him exceeded the desired amount or the average amount expected by economists. It was up in the 2.5% to 4% type of growth range, so that's solid growth for the economy. He got an A minus. The second measurement is inflation, and whether inflation was kept in check and under control. And the Federal Reserve has a goal of somewhere between 1.5 and 2.5, maybe even stretching in some cases to 3% inflation. So let's see how Mr. Bush did. He had an A plus. Inflation was actually below 2% during his first term in office, so that was really kept in check, which was kind of interesting given the growth rate and GDP rate of growth that we had during that time. Unemployment. Mr. Bush in his first term gets an A because the unemployment rate was below the full employment rate of 5%. It was in his first term hovering around between 4.5 and 4%. And budget management, Mr. Bush got a D. Didn't control expenses very well and started to build rather significant deficits, which contributed to an already heavy debt that we had. In Mr. Bush's second term, he kept up the growth pace, so he got an A minus. Inflation creeped up a bit to around 3% to 3.5%. And the reason for that is we had some stumblings with regard to oil prices, and when the price of oil goes up, the price of everything goes up. So we had a small bout of inflation, but not all that much to be concerned about. Still got a decent grade of B plus. Unemployment, A minus. The unemployment rate went up a little bit from his first term, hovered really between the 4.5 and 5% of the full employment rate, and but still did well there. And budget management, he dug his hole deeper and pulled a grade of an F as the deficits widened and contributed significantly to national debt. Well, Mr. Obama had a real struggle in his first term and is struggling a bit in the second. Growth completely stopped during Obama's first term in office as a result of the 2008 financial crisis. We had at best 0% GDP growth, and for I think one quarter during his first term, or a short period in his first term, we actually had negative growth there. But we'll give him a D for starting out. Inflation, interesting. He was able to improve upon Bush's second term record, bring that inflation rate back down. But then again, that would be very typical when you've got declining growth that we saw in his first term. Unemployment, the unemployment rate, the reported unemployment rate went upwards of 12% during his first term in office. The real unemployment rate, as we know, as we've discussed because of reporting, it was a lot higher, falling somewhere between a bad time and actual depression. So Mr. Obama pulled an F in that category. And budget management, he tried to reduce the unemployment rate and get the economy stimulated. So he put together the spending program and recovery program that further greatly deepened the deficits, annual deficits, and again contributed significantly to the national debt. Now, in his second term, growth has remained tepid at best, hovering between the 0.5% and about a 1.5%. So he hasn't climbed out of that hole. Inflation still seems to be held in check, which is a good thing, and also it makes a lot of sense based upon the lack of growth in the economy. Unemployment has been steadily declining. So we're going to give him, the progress has been extremely slow, but at least it's been headed in the right direction consistently. So we'll give him a D-, and we're nowhere near full employment in his second term. And budget management, there's been no cutback in the amount of government spending contributing to the deficits and the national debt. Now we can take these grades and actually put them on a graphical representation, and a graph that you're very familiar with from back in chapter 15. So let's go and do that now. And here's a graph you're all familiar with, our modern model of the economy, and you're familiar with all the ranges as they're laid out. So let's overlay the president's performance, each one of the president's performances here on our model. Mr. Bush, in his first term, had significantly higher growth and was at the full employment rate. So he could be represented in term one by the uppermost blue curve to the right that's flashing. And in his second term, we saw a bit of decline in a couple of measurements. So we had a slippage of his economy back to the left as we slipped slightly below full employment. Now, Mr. Obama started out at a much significantly lower level than Mr. Bush, as it's represented here, because growth was way down, unemployment was way up. So many people talk about the Great Recession of 2008 in almost depression-like terms, and when they see this representation for Obama term one, they say, but shouldn't it be down in the Keynesian range? And no, you got to stop there and think for a second. Mr. Obama had an unemployment rate in his first term hovering around the reported unemployment rate about 12%. That's still a significant distance away from the 30% plus that we saw during the Great Depression, which would put you down in the Keynesian range. Now, because we have made some progress, small progress on GDP growth and steady progress on the unemployment scene, Mr. Obama's second term has shifted our AD curve to the right again, back up in the range and approaching where Mr. Bush was at during his second term. So there's an overlay for you on grading the presidents, and it's a fun exercise and is pretty much on the mark. In the last sections of this chapter, I want to take a deeper look at the multiplier effect and how it works, and then finish the chapter by looking at the velocity of money. Both of these concepts, I guarantee, you're going to see on the AP exam. So we want to understand specifically how they work, and it's really not too difficult at all. So let's get started with the multiplier effect and look at actually how it works. So let's start by doing a quick review of what the multiplier effect is and how it's brought into play. It's brought into play by actions of the federal government or the Federal Reserve System, the Federal Reserve Bank, and we'll talk more about that in Chapter 19. By either one of those, that would generate multiple increases or decreases in income. In other words, GDP. And this is accomplished through, and let's take the government side first, and then we'll get to the Federal Reserve side. The government either spending or not spending money on goods and services directly, or decreasing or increasing taxes. On the Federal Reserve side, the multiplier effect is brought into play by either decreasing or increasing three things, and they can be done individually or collectively together. Here's the first. The Federal Reserve can either increase or decrease the money supply. It could either increase or decrease interest rates. And it either can increase or decrease the reserve ratio on the banks. To understand the multiplier effect, we must become familiar with the propensities and the concept of the propensities. If you're not familiar with the word propensities, it means the likelihood of acting or engaging in something. And the question you may be thinking is, well, why? And the reason why is that they tell us what the impact of the multiplier effect will be. So here's the first propensity measurement that we'll look at. It's called the average propensity to consume a dollar that is put back in the hands of a consumer or a business. And what we mean by the average propensity to consume is the ratio of consumption expenditures to disposable income. The second propensity is the marginal propensity to consume. And that is the change in consumption divided by the change in disposable income that becomes available. It is the fraction of any change in disposable income that is spent on consumer goods. And here we have our equation, the change in consumption over the change in disposable income. Now, when dollars are put back in the hands of consumers or businesses, there may be also a tendency for a portion of that extra money to be saved rather than consumed. So we have another marginal propensity, and that's the marginal propensity to save, which is the fraction, again, saved of any change in disposable income. And here we have our equation, the change in spending over the change in disposable income. Next, we want to move on to the multipliers, because these are what we use to figure out and illustrate the multiplier effect. But before we do, I just want to quickly review what we covered here and really reconfirm and set in place the ideas behind the propensities. The average propensity to consume for a society is a pretty straightforward measurement. It gives us a feel for what the society or the people in the economy typically on average go ahead and spend of their disposable income. Now, the real important measurements are the marginal propensity to consume and the marginal propensity to save, because as it relates to the multiplier effect, what we're looking for here is the effect that spending by the government or a change in the tax structure is going to have on the consumers and businesses' propensity to either consume or to save. So we want to look at the marginal amount. And the marginal propensity to consume and the marginal propensity to save figure in heavily into the multipliers here. So let's start. There are three multipliers that I'm going to tell you about. The investment multiplier, the government spending multiplier, and the tax multiplier. You can effectively take the spending multiplier and set it aside because on the AP exam you're probably not going to be asked a question with regard to the investment multiplier. It's really related to that average propensity to consume. Where you'll get the questions are along the lines of the government spending or the government change in taxes, either decreasing or increasing. So let me first give you the multipliers, show you what they are, and then start to go through and illustrate a couple of examples for you, typical to questions that you'll see on the AP exam. First, the investment multiplier, pretty straightforward, is 1 over the marginal propensity to save. And again, you're probably not going to be asked a question about the investment multiplier. But just in case you are, you can remember that the investment multiplier is exactly the same as the government spending multiplier. It's still a dollar, if you will, that's being spent on consumption, whether it comes from a person, a business, or the government in terms of investing. It's all the same, okay? And that's why to figure out the multiplier, it's exactly the same fraction or ratio, 1 divided by the marginal propensity to save. And notice that these are the same, and they're always a positive figure, okay? Because it's a net add, if you will. We're adding a dollar into the mix, if you will. The other multiplier is the tax multiplier. Now, this can be negative or positive on the numerator, which is the marginal propensity to consume. And let me explain why. If it's a negative number, it would be a negative number, the marginal propensity to consume, if the taxes were increased, because we're taking money away. If it's a tax decrease, okay, we're putting more money in the hands of people, so it will be a positive number. And the tax multiplier effect is the marginal propensity to consume over the marginal propensity to save. The best way to prepare for the multiplier effect questions for the AP exam, whether it comes in the multiple choice section or the free response section, is simply to do the following. Take a look at this chart. And what you need to do is memorize this chart. And really what you only need to memorize 3 of the columns. The marginal propensity to consume column, the government spending multiplier column, which is the same as the investment multiplier column, because the question will always be asked either relating to government spending or the tax multiplier. And then the third column being the tax multiplier column. And here I have them listed as negative figures, so that reflecting a tax increase as opposed to a tax decrease. Now what I'm going to do next is give you an illustration of how, a very simplistic illustration of how the multiplier effect would work that will look very similar to what I had mentioned earlier in the chapter when I first introduced the concept of the multiplier effect, that of a bank making money. And then after that, we're going to go to a couple of real examples from AP exams in the past of questions asked about the multiplier effect, show you how they're phrased, and there'll be one of a couple of ways, and get you familiar with it and show you how to figure out the answer. So let's go to the illustration first. And remember, memorize this chart. Okay, it's not too much. It can be done, and it'll help you cut down and just make the whole process of handling multiplier effect questions a lot simpler. So now let's take a look at a very simple example of how the multiplier effect works. And we're not even going to specifically talk about an increase in government spending or a change in taxation. Let's just talk about a society where there's an increase in income or GDP. Now, you can stop and think here. We can increase income in a way by spending more of the government's money or putting more income into the hands of people through a tax change. So it all works the same. So here we have our scenario where we have an increase in income. Look at round one and the second column in. Let's say this country has had an increase in income or GDP of 1,000. Now, over in the right-hand columns, we have our marginal propensity to consume and our marginal propensity to save based upon the percentages and ratios from our chart that we memorized. This country has a marginal propensity to consume of 0.75. So we take that $1,000 and we apply the marginal propensity to consume, and we say that $750 of that $1,000 is going to be spent or consumed, and 25% or $250 is going to be put into savings, which will also translate into investments. Okay, so let's look at the marginal propensity to consume column and see how $1 turns into another. So $750 is going to be spent, and that winds up becoming somebody else's income. So somebody else's income is increased by $750, and now we apply the same ratios here to that $750, meaning the marginal propensity to consume is 0.75 and the marginal propensity to save is 0.25. So of that $750 of additional income, we have $562 that is going to consumption and $187.50 that'll go to savings. Now that $562 of consumption gets turned around again and goes yet to the next person's income. So they receive $562. And again, that $562 is subject to the marginal propensity to consume and the marginal propensity to save. So 75% of the $562 winds up going back out for consumption, a total of $421.88, and we have $140.62 going into the bank or investments. And that $421.88 that's going to be consumed goes yet again to the next person. And so it continues on where we see the growth in the income for the society. If you look at the bottom row where we have the totals here, in our 4 rounds in our multiplier example, we have increased the final outcome for income is $4,000. We have 4 rounds, and the consumption spending was $3,000, and the final outcome for savings based upon that initial $1,000 is $1,000 worth of savings, and that's how effectively it works. Now let's move on to actually looking at a couple of sample questions and the type of questions that you'll be presented with on the AP exam. All right, now let's take a look at some sample multiplier effect questions. And on the AP exam, you're going to get questions in either the multiple choice or the free response section of the exams, where you may need to figure out the effect of the multiplier. And the question is going to come in one of 2 ways. The first way, they may just be wanting you to recall one of the figures off the chart that I asked you to memorize. And I'm going to give you first 2 examples of questions and how they'd be posed asking you to recall what one multiplier is when given another figure. For example, you might be given the marginal propensity to consume and be asked what the government spending multiplier would be. The other type of question is that you would be given either the marginal propensity to consume information or the marginal propensity to save information, and then some information about additional government spending or reduction in government spending, and or combined with a increase in taxes or potential decrease in taxes, and then you'd be able to have to work with a couple of the multipliers from your memory of the chart to figure out what the answer is. So let's take a look at both types of questions that are coming your way, and let's start with the ones with the simple recall. For example, you may be asked what would be the value of the tax multiplier if the MPC is 0.6. Now, in these cases, when you're not given an indication as whether increase or decrease in taxes, always go with the negative approach, because taxes in general, when you think of them, it's a negative connotation. So if you recall from your chart, at an MPC level of 0.6, the tax multiplier would be a negative 1.5. Here's a second example. What is the value of the government spending multiplier if the MPC is 0.75? The answer here from pure recall standpoint would be 4. As a matter of fact, that's the illustration that we just looked at on the prior slide. And these are the simple recall examples. Okay, now let's go further, where you're given either the MPC or the MPS and some other information about government spending or taxes, and asked to figure out a solution. So here's our first example. If we have a country that has a marginal propensity to consume of 0.75, in which the government increased spending by $100 and increased taxes by $100, what then would be the change in GDP, or national income? The answer is $100. And here's how you'd go about figuring this out. Step 1. The government multiplier is 4 from recall of your chart. Also, to show you, it's 1 over the marginal propensity to save of 0.25, which is 4, times the $100 in government spending. So we have $400 total that the government multiplier says we have from the spending. Step 2, we need to take into account the negative influence of the increased taxes. And we know that based upon the marginal propensity to consume, that right off the chart from memory, that the tax multiplier at this level is negative 3. So we have 3 times the $100 increase in taxes, and we have a negative effect of $300. And then it becomes a simple offsetting and balance situation in step 3, where we have increased income by $400, but because of the tax increase of $300, the net income or increase to the society is $100. Now that's the type of question when we are given the marginal propensity to consume and asked about government multiplier and tax multiplier. There will be a time where you might not get the marginal propensity to consume, you'll be given the marginal propensity to save. Let's take a look at another example. Say there is a country with a marginal propensity to save of 0.4, in which the government increased spending by $200, and in this case decreased taxes by $100, what would be the change in income, or GDP? Now here we're given the marginal propensity to save instead of the marginal propensity to consume. But we didn't need to memorize anything about the marginal propensity to save, because we know that if the marginal propensity to save is 0.4, the marginal propensity to consume is 0.6. So we've memorized that in the table, but we also know that from simple math here. So let's go through the steps of figuring this out. The answer is $650 in change in income. But here are the steps. Let's take the government multiplier first. The government multiplier at a marginal propensity to consume of 0.6 is 2.5. And we times that by the $200 in increased government spending, and we come up with $500. Now we need to consider the decrease in taxes, which is a good thing. It'll come out as a plus. At the 0.6 marginal propensity to consume level, we know the tax multiplier in this case is a positive because we have a tax decrease, a positive 1.5. We multiply that by the $100 in decreased taxes, and we have an additional $150. Now we're back to our simple combination math here of 500 plus 150 gives us the 650 in additional income or increase in GDP. If you would like to work on some more multiplier effect questions, let's do so, or be sure to catch up with me in the Course Resource Center, and we'll go through a couple of other sample scenarios to give you some more practice. The last section of this chapter involves the definitions around and the concepts of the velocity of money. So let's take a look at this concept. The velocity of money is a pretty easy concept to understand, and I'd say you're almost guaranteed to see a question on it in the multiple choice section of the AP exam. The velocity of money refers to how many times per year the typical dollar bill is used, or what we call in financial markets, turned over, to pay for a newly produced, and that's important, newly produced good or service. Two things about the velocity of money. The more turns that a dollar bill makes, more times it's used, usually reflects a robust economy, and the more time that money is turned over, that promotes growth in an economy. Secondly, technology can help promote turns of the money tremendously. With the invention of the debit card, the velocity of money in our society picked up dramatically and helped to propel forward economic growth. And that's why the debit card was such an important technology tool to help that along. Now, we can calculate the velocity of money, and it's a very, very simple calculation. And here's how it works. We divide nominal GDP by the quantity of money in our money supply. You'll also hear the velocity of money referred to or expressed as, and this is the more formal definition, the equation of exchange, meaning MV equals price times quantity. The M in the MV is for the quantity of money in the money supply. The quantity of money in the money supply by velocity is equal to price times quantity. And here's a simple example, or a typical example of a question you would get on the AP exam. Suppose that the economy produces 100 pizzas in a year, that a pizza also sells for $10, and the quantity of money in the economy is $50. They'll always use nice round numbers for you on the AP exam just to make sure you understand the concept. They're not trying to trick you. So what is the velocity of money? In other words, how many times does a dollar turn over to consume all the pizzas? So if we go back to our simple equation, the velocity equals price times the number of output or income divided by the money supply. And in this case, we have at $10 a piece for each pizza, we have 100 pizzas being produced and consumed, and there's only $50 in the economy. What would be the velocity? And from your simple math, I think you can see the velocity is 20 times it turns over. Hey, that brings us to an end to Chapter 18 on fiscal policy and management. A really important chapter, and we've covered an awful lot of information. The next chapter is just as important, and many people would say is even more important, because it's the chapter on monetary policy and the Federal Reserve. And most people say that's more important because that's really where the action is in terms of controlling and balancing the economy. It comes not with fiscal policy, but with monetary policy. So I'll be looking forward to seeing you in Chapter 19. We'll see you there.